In my part of the world, the American South, there exists a pervasive belief that many, if not most people, have never heard the gospel. People in our overwhelmingly Christian cities here love to put up billboards sharing the good news, as if anyone driving past will be surprised to learn of this little-known fellow named Jesus. Despite this odd belief, the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection may actually be the most widely known story in all of Western culture today. Christian or not, you've probably been at least somewhat familiar with this story since childhood. Jesus was a wise teacher, or the Son of God, depending on who you ask, who taught people to repent of their sins, love their neighbor, and seek God. He ended up getting crucified, but was said to have risen from the dead 3 days later. That's the gist that most Westerners know, but there is a lot more. Some of which has been purposely hidden from public view for more than a millennium because it ran contrary to the favored interpretation of those teaching the story in the first place. Today, though, non-sectarian scholarship on the topic is available, though not always conveniently accessible. In an effort to make this scholarship more accessible to us lay people, I've put together the Crucifixion and Resurrection of Jesus, Iceberg. I've done this with the aid of 2 New Testament scholars, Dr. Ian Mills and Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is actually participating in a must-see online event on April 9th, 2022, where he will be debating on the topic, Did the Resurrection of Jesus Really Happen? His debate opponent will be Christian New Testament scholar Dr. Mike Licona. Now, I'm usually hesitant to recommend debates on such topics because of how fruitless and frustrating they can be, but I'm happy to recommend this one for the following reasons. Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona are friends who have debated many times before. They're sharing their notes with each other beforehand, so all points and counterpoints will be well calculated rather than spontaneous. And most importantly, this will be an all-day event with Q&A. So this will almost definitely be the most thorough scholarly debate on the resurrection you have ever seen. If you can't attend the live sessions, no problem. Signing up through my affiliate link in the description as well as the pinned comment will give you access to recordings of each session, which you can watch whenever you'd like, as often as you would like. No matter how long after April 9th, 2022 you're watching this, it is still available. Of course, every purchase through my link will support my channel directly, and I'll greatly appreciate that. Okay, let's get onto the iceberg. We will, of course, begin with better-known facts about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and work our way down to the truly obscure. Layer 1, the historical Jesus. Jesus, the Jewish apocalypticist.
So it's not a term that most people throw around, but biblical scholars do all the time, apocalypticism. It's a scholarly term. It's a modern term that scholars have invented to explain a worldview that was very widespread in the days of Jesus, that had been around for a couple hundred years before Jesus in Israel and outside of Israel among some Jews. The term apocalypticism comes from the Greek word apocalypse, which people do know. Apocalypse really, it literally means something like a revealing or an unveiling or a disclosure. These people were called apocalypticists because they believed that God had revealed to them or disclosed to them the heavenly secrets that could make sense of earthly realities. What they learned, and the secrets were that this world that we live in now is controlled by forces of evil, cosmic forces of evil, that are making life miserable for most people, except for those who side up with them and then who become, as a result, rich and famous and powerful. These forces of evil then are working through humans to exploit and harm others. And God, for some reason, has relinquished control. But God's soon going to intervene to overthrow these forces of evil and bring in a good kingdom on earth, unlike these wretched kingdoms we live with now. There'll be a kingdom of God here on earth. The forces of evil will be destroyed, so will everybody else who has sided with them. And it's not just the people who are alive at the time. Even the people who have died are going to be raised from the dead in order to face judgment. Those who have sided with God will be rewarded with this coming kingdom. Those who have sided with the forces of evil, the devil and his demons and these other powers, will be brought back from the dead to be shown the error of their ways and then to be ruthlessly destroyed. And the idea is this is going to happen soon, very soon. And so this is the apocalyptic view. It's a view that Jesus had, John the Baptist had, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls had, Pharisees had. It was a very, very common point of view. And so it's a view that scholars for over 100 years now have said Jesus himself had.
A threat to the empire. Crucifixion, as the Romans employed it, was not an ordinary means of capital punishment. The Romans had many more efficient ways to execute criminals. A guilty man might be decapitated, strangled, or compelled to drink poison. Crucifixion, by contrast, was a slow, public, and relatively involved way to kill someone. It was consequently reserved for a particular class of offenses against the Roman order. Crucifixion served as an advertisement for Roman power. This is what happens, the cross said, to anyone who challenges the authority of Rome. The slaves who followed Spartacus in revolt against the empire, for instance, were crucified en masse. Similarly, General Varus crucified thousands of Galilean Jews who participated in a revolt against Roman occupiers. Jesus' death by crucifixion, then, suggests something about the Roman perception of him. Jesus wasn't crucified for preaching love and kindness, disturbing the peace, or claiming to be a god. Jesus was crucified because Roman administrators believed he represented a challenge to imperial power. I asked Dr. Bart Ehrman about this, and he argued for this view by citing the Gospels themselves.
Jesus, in the apocalyptic view, preached that there was a coming kingdom of God. The kingdom would be here on earth. It's a real kingdom. It's not, Jesus was not talking about your soul going to heaven when you died. He's talking about a kingdom here on earth. He was crucified by the Romans for a clearly stated reason in the Gospels themselves. He was crucified, according to the Gospels, for claiming that he was the king of the Jews. An apocalypticist might mean this in some kind of apocalyptic sense, that God is going to destroy everything and set up a new king. But the Romans were not apocalypticists. They heard somebody who was claiming that he was the ruler of the Jews when they were the rulers of the Jews. The only way for somebody to become a king of the Jews, who wasn't a Roman already, was to overthrow the Roman Empire. So he was crucified for sedition. He was crucified as an insurrectionist, as the Gospels themselves say, and it makes sense apocalyptically because he's preaching about this coming kingdom, and so they concluded he thought he was going to be the king of this coming kingdom.
Scholarly conflict on Jesus' burial. According to the Gospels, Jesus' body was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Some scholars have expressed incredulity toward this detail of the Gospel narrative, noting allusions in Greek and Latin literature to the denial of burial to those crucified. The elder Seneca, for instance, muses that nature provides a kind of burial for everyone, including those crucified, since their body decomposes into nothingness. If the point of Roman crucifixion is to advertise the consequences of threatening imperial order, it makes sense to leave up the display as long as possible.
Yeah, I'm one of those scholars, and I'll just say that I'm in the minority on this. Most scholars don't think this. I decided actually to look up every reference I could find in every Greek and Roman source that talked about crucifixion. And so I read every reference I could find about it, and none of them describe how crucifixion happens. They don't describe like what they do when like how they actually do the act of crucifixion. And most of them don't say anything about what happens afterwards. But those who do say something are virtually uniform. When somebody got crucified, they were not allowed to be buried. Part of the punishment by the Romans was that people were left on their crosses after they died so that they would decompose on the cross. They would rot away, and the scavengers, especially the birds, would go after them.
The evidence surrounding this topic is complicated, though. There are references in both Philo and Josephus, two contemporary Jewish authors, to the burial of crucified criminals. Philo says that a Roman governor allowed the victims of crucifixion to be buried by their families on special occasions. This remark, of course, suggests that burial of crucified criminals was possible, but not quite normal. Josephus, in contrast, compares his neighboring Idumeans unfavorably to Judeans for leaving their dead unburied, arguing that Jews even bury the victims of crucifixion. Finally, there is archaeological evidence that crucified persons in first century Judea were sometimes allowed a normal burial, the first century tomb of a crucified man named Jehohanan. So, was Jesus buried? It's possible, but its probability depends on the scholar you ask. The historical method can't confirm the resurrection. So I intended to have Bart Ehrman explain this uniquely for this video, but when I interviewed him for this video, I forgot to ask him about it. So instead, I'm going to show you a clip from one of Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Lycona's previous debates, where Dr. Ehrman explains why scholars cannot and do not use the historical method to support the resurrection narrative.
That's the problem with history. It's not like the natural sciences. The natural sciences work by repeated demonstration. And so, for example, if I wanted to show you that bars of iron will sink in that swimming pool and bars of ivory soap will float, all I need to do is to get 100 bars of both and start chucking them in. I'll chuck in 100 bars of iron, they'll sink every time. I'll chuck in the soap, they'll float every time. That gives us a predictive probability of what will happen the 101st time. That's how sciences work, by repeated experimentation. Historians don't have that luxury. Historians can only establish on the basis of surviving evidence what probably happened in the past, and by definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence, or else they're not a miracle. This creates the dilemma for the historian, and is the reason why historians cannot prove Jesus was raised from the dead. Historians, by their very nature, establish what most probably happened in the past, but a miracle, by its definition, is the least probable occurrence in the past. The least probable occurrence cannot be most probable. This is the problem with the resurrection. Even if it happened, it defies imagination and cannot be accepted as a historically proven event. Belief in the resurrection. If you believe in the resurrection, it is for theological reasons. The resurrection is a theological assertion about what God did to Jesus. It is not, and it cannot be, based on historical proof.
Now, if you want to hear even more fleshed out arguments for and against the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, definitely check out the event I mentioned earlier. Layer 2, differences and contradictions in the Gospels. Alright, I'm going to have Dr. Ehrman open this topic up, and then we will discuss some differences and contradictions in the Gospel accounts surrounding Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection.
You know, it doesn't make the resurrection narratives in the New Testament different from other narratives that are given in various accounts. It makes them like so many of the other accounts, which is when you have the same account in more than one source, often they are at odds with each other. And so you can compare what Gospels say, take the same story in two Gospels, you compare them and say, whoa, we've got some differences here. And it happens with the resurrection narratives. Some things are just different, but you know, they kind of look contradictory. How many women go to the tomb, and who were they? When they got to the tomb, what did they see there? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Did they see an angel? What did they see there? What did the person tell them about Jesus? They always say he's raised from the dead, but what did they tell them to do? And did the women do it or not? And you know, so like you can just go through these things and you realize, actually, these are at odds with each other on, you know, they might seem like little points, but we're talking about the resurrection here. What really happened, even if you think it did happen. You combine that with the fact that these sources are written, the earliest source is 40 years later by somebody who wasn't there, who didn't even speak the same language as the people who were there, who just heard stories that were floating around, and they all had heard stories. Well, so why do you have the contradictions? And are some of the contradictions completely irreconcilable? I think so. And so what does that do to the value of these books as historical sources? That's going to be one of the things that I think we'll be talking about a good deal in this debate. How reliable are these as historical sources?
Jesus' last words. What were Jesus' last words? My God, why have you forsaken me? Or into your hands I commit my spirit? Or it is finished? It depends on which gospel you read. Matthew and Mark report only the first, which alludes to Psalm 22. But Luke makes no mention of this. Jesus' final words in Luke come from a different psalm, into your hands I commit my spirit being the first line of Psalm 31. Finally, the Gospel of John doesn't have Jesus quote either psalm. Jesus in John does not despair as in Matthew and Mark, or resign himself to God's will as in Luke. Rather, Jesus declares from the cross that his work is complete. He says, "It is finished." Jesus' last words in each gospel make sense as a part of each author's own portrayal of Jesus. But what Jesus really said with his expiring breath is anyone's guess. When was the stone rolled away? In the gospel accounts, Jesus' tomb was closed with a large stone. In Mark, the women worry about who will move the stone for them as they make their way to visit Jesus' resting place. But as they approached the tomb, the earliest gospel states, they saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. It's not clear when or how it happened, but the stone was removed before the women arrived. Matthew gives a slightly more dramatic account. The women go to see the tomb, and suddenly there's an earthquake, a flash of light, and an angel who descends to roll back the stone. We know the women were watching because the angel turns to address them, saying, "Do not be afraid." So when was the stone rolled back? It depends on the gospel you read. For a much more dramatic account of the stone's removal, you'll have to wait until further down in the iceberg. How did Judas die? Judas, the follower of Jesus who betrayed his master, died a tragic death. But what happened? Matthew says he returned his 30 pieces of silver to the Jewish leaders and then hanged himself. The leaders, Matthew tells us, used Judas' money to buy a field to bury foreigners. The book of Acts, on the other hand, says Judas used the money to buy a field where he, quote, fell headfirst and his body burst open and his intestines spilled out. The authors thus describe two very different kinds of death. Hanging, after all, usually involves falling head last. Moreover, these Gospels give different accounts of Judas' money. Did he spend it or not? Where did Jesus meet the disciples? The Gospel of Mark, probably the first Gospel written, does not describe Jesus reuniting with his disciples. The women discover an empty tomb, and the angels remind them that Jesus promised to meet his disciples in Galilee. The Gospel of Matthew supplies this scene. Jesus appears to his disciples on top of a mountain and delivers the Great Commission. The Gospel of Luke tells a different story. Here again, women discover the empty tomb and meet Jesus, but when they tell the disciples, no one believes them. On the same day, says the author of Luke, Jesus met two men on the road to Emmaus, just outside of Jerusalem. They returned to Jerusalem that very evening to tell the disciples about Jesus, and while they're talking, Jesus appears to the disciples. Among other things, Jesus instructs his disciples not to leave Jerusalem until they receive the power of the Holy Spirit, a promise fulfilled at Pentecost later in the book of Acts. So, Matthew depicts Jesus' disciples returning to Galilee to meet with Jesus, while Luke describes Jesus instructing them on the very day of his resurrection to remain in Jerusalem until Pentecost. Neither mentions any of the events described in the other. The day of Jesus' death. In the Synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus celebrates a Passover meal with his disciples before he's arrested. The Gospel of Luke makes it explicit that they ate this meal, as was customary, at the end of the day of preparation. Jesus then prays with his disciples in the garden and is arrested. After daybreak, then, Jesus is tried before the Sanhedrin and then before Pilate. Finally, he's crucified at noon. The Gospel of John, however, describes Jesus dying on the day of preparation before the Passover meal. In fact, the fourth Gospel reminds the reader 3 times that all these events, Jesus' trial, Jesus' death, and Jesus' burial, happens on the day of preparation for the Passover. Jesus dies in the Gospel of John the day before the Passover meal. So why the difference? Some scholars believe the Gospels simply received different traditions about Jesus' death. Other scholars who believe the author of John used the synoptics as a source suggest that the fourth gospel changed the sequence in order to make Jesus die at the same time as the Passover lamb. Jesus is, for John's author, the Lamb of God. A threat to the temple. The notion that Jesus promised to destroy and rebuild the temple appears twice in Mark. In the trial before Jewish leaders, Mark says Jesus was falsely accused of claiming that he would destroy the Jewish temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Even on this point, Mark adds, their testimony did not agree. Mark then reminds us of this charge a few scenes later. People passing by Jesus' crucifixion mock him, shouting, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." While these passages suggest the animus between Jesus and the Jewish leadership had something to do with a threat to the temple and a promise of restoration, Mark seems to indicate that Jesus never said any such thing. The Gospel of John gives a different perspective. In the fourth Gospel, Jesus stands in the temple courts declaring, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The people, of course, are outraged. The author of John interjects at this point that Jesus had been misunderstood. He was speaking about the temple of the body. The disciples would understand Jesus' words, the author tells us, only after Jesus rose from the dead. Layer 3. Things they didn't teach you in Sunday school. The doubt traditions.
In every story where Jesus appears to the disciples, it says that they doubted. They doubted that he'd been raised from the dead. That's strange. Why would they doubt it if he's right there in front of them? The strangest verse in this entire sequence of this, all these narratives, is actually in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 1, verse 3, which says that, so Jesus has been raised from the dead at the beginning of Acts. He's just been resurrected, and he's talking with the disciples. And we're told in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, that Jesus spent 40 days proving to his disciples with many proofs that he had been raised from the dead. People skip over that verse and don't think about it, but think about it for a second. Why would Jesus have to spend 40 days giving many proofs that he was raised from the dead? He's there. He's talking to them. They can touch him. They can see him eat. What kind of proofs would he be giving that they need 40 days of it? I mean, surely if somebody shows up in your living room and you talk to him and you feel him and you hear him and you see him eat, you think, you don't need 40 days to be convinced he's doing that. So anyway, so what's this doubt tradition all about? I think this is an understudied question. I think that the reason you have these doubt traditions in the New Testament is because some of the disciples really did doubt whether Jesus was raised from the dead. And the fact that they doubted it got written into the narratives.
Zombie invasion. Jesus' death is accompanied by signs and wonders. All three synoptic gospels describe a supernatural darkness and the splitting of the temple curtain during Jesus' crucifixion. Matthew, however, adds a sequence of events unique to this gospel. The earth shook, says Matthew, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. And then enter the zombies. Bodies of many holy ones who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. But what is the author of Matthew actually picturing here? The tombs break open on Good Friday as Jesus is dying, but the holy ones don't enter Jerusalem until after Jesus' resurrection? This leaves me wondering, how did they spend their weekend, those 2 intervening days? Did they just wait in their tombs? And where did they go after Jesus' ascension? Did they return to their tombs? The gospel doesn't say. Jesus didn't fit the Jewish idea of Messiah.
This is one of the hardest things for many Christians today to get their minds around. Why don't Jews realize that Jesus is the Messiah? He's predicted all over the place in the Old Testament. You've got predictions of him being born in Bethlehem, to a virgin, to him doing miracles, to him being rejected, to him suffering, to him dying, being executed, being raised from the dead. You find proof throughout the entire Old Testament. Why don't Jews see that? Are they blind? Are they hard-hearted? Are they stupid? Can't they read? What? I don't get it. And my Christian students they just generally don't get it. So I have to explain to them that, in fact, there were no Jews in the days of Jesus prior to his disciples saying that he was the Messiah after they believed in the resurrection. There were no Jews who thought that these passages that are quoted by Christians were referring to the Messiah. And so Christians are familiar, for example, with Isaiah chapter 53. And it's impossible for a Christian or most anyone else to read Isaiah 53 without thinking this is talking about Jesus. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. And by his wounds, we are healed. Well, it's Jesus suffering for us, for our sins. It's right there, right? Why don't Jews see that? So I tell my students, I said, yes, this seems to be about somebody who's suffering for the sake of others. I said, now read the passage and find the word Messiah. They read, well, the Messiah is not mentioned here. No, the Messiah is not mentioned there. Who is mentioned there? Somebody called the servant of the Lord. That's a Messiah, right? So, well, who does Isaiah think the servant of the Lord is? Let's read Isaiah. And I point out to Isaiah chapter 49, verse 3, where Isaiah explicitly says that the servant of the Lord is Israel. It can't be Israel. It's somebody who suffers for others. Well, when was this written? So I try to explain to them, look, there were just no Jews who thought this was a messianic prophecy. Neither was Isaiah 7 about the virgin birth. Neither was being born in Bethlehem. These are not seen as messianic prophecies. And so in Jewish thinking at the time of Jesus, the Messiah, there were various views among Jews what the Messiah would be. The standard explanation was that he would be one like King David. The word Messiah means anointed one who's anointed as one who having God's favor, and it was used of ancient kings. And so the Messiah will be an anointed king, a Messiah like David was, who was an anointed king. There'll be a future king as a military leader, a political leader. He will drive out the enemy. He'll establish Israel as a sovereign state. He'll rule out of Jerusalem. That's what the Messiah will be, a great figure of power. Others thought that he wouldn't be a human ruler. He'd be a divine ruler, one like a son of man that Daniel talked about in Daniel chapter 7, a kind of a cosmic judge of the earth. Others thought that he would be a great priest who would rule the people of God by his interpretations of the law. There were different expectations. All of them thought that, in fact, the Messiah was going to be somebody great and powerful. Jesus was not powerful in the eyes of the world. He did not throw out the Romans. He did not establish a kingdom in Israel. He didn't destroy the enemy. He got destroyed by the enemy. He was arrested and he was tortured to death, publicly humiliated. And this is the opposite of a Messiah. So Jews, most Jews, when Christians said Jesus is the Messiah, Jews said, what are you talking about? That's nuts. He's the opposite of what the Messiah is supposed to be. So that's why. That's why, because it just was not the expectation. Christians who thought Jesus was the Messiah had a pretty simple reasoning. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus suffered and died and was raised from the dead. Therefore, the Messiah has to suffer and die and rise from the dead because Jesus is the Messiah, and that's what happened to him. And Jews said, yeah, actually, that's not supposed to happen with the Messiah.
Crucifixion as a curse. Second Temple Jews believed that victims of crucifixion were subject to a special curse. Deuteronomy 21:23 states that he is cursed who is hung from a tree. In its Deuteronomic context, this probably did not refer to crucifixion, but to the exposure of the body of an executed criminal. Nevertheless, contemporary Jewish interpreters like Philo and the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls associated Deuteronomy's hung from a tree with crucifixion. The same interpretation appears in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where Paul argues that Christ saved humanity from the curse of the law through becoming accursed by hanging from a tree. Did all 12 of Jesus' disciples believe in and preach the resurrection?
That's a really interesting question, and I'd say it's impossible to say because the historical evidence doesn't give us much. In the Gospels, they come to believe, and the book of Acts, they come to believe. According to Paul, they came to believe. So that's the New Testament testimony. It is also very interesting that in the book of Acts, which is called the Acts of the Apostles, it's supposed to be about how the apostles spread Christianity after Jesus' death. Most of these disciples never show up outside of being named as a group in the first chapter or two. In other words, you have all the, you've got 11. The one's been made, a new one's been added to make 12. But when you read Acts in chapters 1 through 12, you get Peter, who's the main character, and John, who shows up sometimes. The others don't do anything, and the later they don't do anything throughout the. So why aren't there stories of these others? Could it be that there weren't any stories to tell? I think it's a fascinating question. I don't think there's a good way to answer, but it does strike me as very odd.
Who were the robbers? The Synoptic Gospels describe Jesus crucified with two others, described as leistai in Mark and Matthew. The Gospel of Luke gives a dialogue in which one mocks Jesus and another confesses Jesus' innocence. Christian tradition has identified these victims of Roman crucifixion as the impenitent and penitent thief, respectively. But were they really thieves? Notably, the Gospels don't use the ordinary word for thief, kleptes. Further, it would be strange to hear of an ordinary thief punished by crucifixion. As already discussed, crucifixion was usually reserved for egregious threats to the Roman order. Is there a better way to understand the scene that these evangelists are painting? The word lestes is derived from the word for plunder, and so has traditionally been translated as robber, referring to someone who steals by threat of violence rather than stealth. A glance at other first-century uses of the word offers another explanation, though. Josephus describes the Sicarii and the Zealots as lestai. These were Jewish groups who violently opposed the Roman occupation of Palestine, most famously publicly assassinating Romans and cooperating Judeans. This is the kind of criminal who we would expect to see crucified. Plausibly then, the synoptics use lestai for Jesus' companions on the cross, not to refer to robbers, but something closer to rebels or even terrorists. But did you know that these robbers had names? We'll get to that further down in the iceberg. The later the gospel, the more blame it places on the Jewish people.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting exercise that if you just line the Gospels up chronologically. So Mark is almost certainly the first Gospel, written about 40 years after Jesus' death, usually dated around 70 or so. Matthew, some years later, a decade later or so. Luke, a little bit after that, in the mid-'80s maybe. The Gospel of John, the last Gospel, in the '90s. And then after that, you get other Gospels that also could be figured into this calculus I'm going to give now. In the Gospel of Mark, what happens is Jesus goes into when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, he goes into the temple and he's disturbed by what he sees there. And he overturns tables of people changing money, and he drives out people selling animals because he thinks that they've made the temple of God into a business practice. And so he's upset. This gets the leaders of Jerusalem upset with him because they're in favor of the temple. That's the reason they exist, is to promote the worship of the temple. And eventually, over the course of the week, they get more and more upset with him, and they end up turning him over to the Roman authorities, and he's put on trial before Pontius Pilate. And Pilate at his trial, in Mark, says to the Sadducees, the scribes and the Pharisees, the scribes and the chief priests, he says, what's he done wrong? And they don't answer him. They just say, crucify him. And so he kind of shrugs his shoulders and crucifies him. And so he didn't know what he had done wrong, but he caved into what they said. So that's the first account. And so there, it's kind of a shared responsibility between Jewish leaders and Pilate. When you get to the Gospel of Matthew, you have that scene again, the temple and everything, and the scene of the trial. But now Pilate is really upset. He doesn't think Jesus has done anything wrong, and he would like to release him. But no, the crowd, the Jewish leaders and the crowd cry out, they want him to be crucified. So in Matthew, Pilate calls in for water, a basin of water to be brought in, and he washes his hands and he says, I am innocent of this man's blood. So he doesn't want to do it. He's innocent. You want it? Okay, you take the responsibility. And the entire Jewish crowd, not just the leaders, the entire crowd of Jews cries out, his blood be upon us and our children. In other words, they take responsibility and they pass it on to their descendants. That's Matthew 27:25, and that's a verse that got used for some horrible anti-Semitic purposes over the years. Luke is a little bit later, and Luke doesn't have Pilate washing his hands, but in Luke's gospel, Pilate actively declares Jesus innocent 3 times. Actually says he is innocent. He's done nothing wrong. He doesn't ask, has he done anything? He declares him innocent 3 times. He sends him off to King Herod, the Jewish king, and he declares him innocent. They're all saying he's innocent. It's the Jewish people who insist that he be crucified. And Luke then says, and so Pilate delivered him up to their will. The Gospel of John, the last gospel, also has Pilate declaring Jesus innocent 3 times. But the chief priests insist that Pilate crucify him. And then in the Greek, you don't get this in many English translations. What it says is the chief priests accused him. And so Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. it's talking about the chief priests. If you read John carefully in the Greek, he's saying the chief priests crucified him. You say, yeah, but they didn't crucify. I know they didn't crucify, but I'm just saying that John is really stressing Jewish guilt. So what happens then is Pilate gets more and more innocent over time. He doesn't want to do it over time. And the reason is because if Pilate is innocent, then who's guilty? And so this is part of the Christian opposition to Jews and Judaism that's on the rise during this period. And it goes on from there, and it gets worse and worse, obviously.
Layer 4, textual variants, non-Christian accounts, and other mysteries. The endings of Mark. In the last chapter of the Gospel according to Mark, 3 women discover the empty tomb and receive angelic instructions for the disciples. The oldest and most reliable manuscripts end with the line, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Most manuscripts, however, contain the so-called longer ending of Mark. This ending consists of 12 verses which give an abbreviated account of 3 of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. The first is his appearance to Mary, the second to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, and the third is to his disciples to deliver the Great Commission, including instructions to handle serpents and drink poison, as notoriously practiced in some Appalachian Pentecostal churches. This longer ending was printed in most Bibles, including the King James Version, until the advent of modern textual criticism. There is also a shorter ending that describes the women reporting their findings to the disciples and the disciples receiving instruction from Jesus. This is just 2 short sentences of an ending. The report that the women ran immediately to the disciples sits awkwardly next to the ending of the original gospel, in which the author reports that, because of their fear, the women told no one what they had seen. Only one manuscript, the Old Latin Codex Bobiensis, smooths out the inconsistency by erasing the embarrassing line from the original ending. There is one even stranger ending to Mark, but we'll get to that in a bit. Is the Ascension in the Gospels? Does Jesus' ascension, his return to heaven, ever appear in the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, and John do not mention the event. Matthew ends abruptly with Jesus' Great Commission, and Mark even more abruptly before Jesus' resurrection appearances. John has an authorial conclusion following a series of Jesus' appearances, but no allusion to the ascension. Most manuscripts of Luke, however, include the sentence, "While he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven." This is in chapter 24 of Luke. Some of our earliest and best manuscripts, however, omit the final clause. The variation in the manuscripts probably has something to do with the fact that Luke's sequel, the book of Acts, begins with its own description of Jesus' ascension. One of 2 things must have happened. Possibility 1, the author of Luke Acts ended his gospel with the ascension, and some later scribe, thinking it was redundant coming right before Acts, deleted it. Possibility 2, the author did not include an ascension in the gospel, and a scribe, having read Acts, added it as a fitting conclusion to the life of Jesus. The United Bible Society's editorial committee, an international group of scholars tasked with producing the most widely used critical edition of the New Testament, could not agree on which explanation was most likely. Most modern Bibles, consequently, leave the verse in Luke with a note about its dubious status. Was Jesus stabbed to death? All 4 canonical Gospels describe Jesus' life ending in crucifixion, but a textual variant in the Gospel of Matthew describes Jesus stabbed with a Roman spear while he's on the cross about to die. In these manuscripts, Roman guards pierce Jesus' side just before he cries out and expires. The really strange thing about this variant is that it's supported by all the best and most reliable manuscripts of Matthew. This variant reading enjoys roughly the same manuscript support as the shortest ending of Mark, which is now printed in all scholarly editions. So, what's the difference? Was Jesus originally stabbed to death in the Gospel of Matthew, and some Christian scribe removed this inconsistency with the other Gospels? Well, honestly, it's possible, but scholars have generally held to a different explanation. There's a close, though not verbatim, parallel in John, where Jesus' side is pierced after his death by a Roman spear. Scholars have plausibly suggested that this was copied by memory, to explain the difference in wording, into the margins of an early copy of Matthew, and then a subsequent scribe mistakenly included the marginal note in the text of Matthew. This kind of reader's note turned copying error has been seen before. Still, one has to wonder, if this had been a less striking change to our traditional picture of Jesus' death, would scholars have disregarded the best manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel in favor of this hypothetical? Father, forgive them. In a supreme act of charity, Jesus forgave his executioners as he hung from the cross. Father, forgive them, reads the Gospel according to Luke, for they know not what they do. But was this originally part of Luke's Gospel, or did a scribe add it later? Many of our earliest and most reliable manuscripts do not contain this famous line. The line is absent from the only papyrus we have for Luke, called P75. The question scholars must ask, then, is whether it's more likely that scribes would erase the line from Luke or add it in. Some scholars believe scribes gave the line to Jesus in imitation of the martyr Stephen's similar statement in Acts 7. Other scholars argue that scribes might have removed the line because it was important for them to maintain the Jewish people were guilty of deicide, that is, the murder of God. Since this allegation was used to justify centuries of anti-Semitism, scribes might have been uneasy with Jesus forgiving the Jewish people from the cross. The question of the verse's authenticity continues to divide scholars, and each editorial team charged with updating and developing new Bible translations makes their own decision about whether or not to include it. Alexamenos Graffito. The oldest surviving visual depiction of Jesus' crucifixion is probably a graffito from the Palatine Hill in Rome. Remarkably, this 2nd or 3rd century representation of Jesus' crucifixion is not some pious portrait by an early Christian, but a caricature meant to mock the beliefs of Christ's followers. The image depicts a crucified man with the head of a donkey. A spectator stands below the crucified man with an arm upraised. The caption reads, Alexamenos, presumably the spectator's name, worships his God. The artist is mocking a Christian named Alexamenos for worshiping someone who was crucified. Jesus is the only crucified figure known to historians who was worshipped as a god. The donkey's head further suggests that this graffiti was directed at Christians. See, pagan critics of ancient Judaism suggested, I guess jokingly, that a donkey lived in the Holy of Holies, the center of the Jerusalem temple, to which no one but the high priest was admitted. There is 2nd and 3rd century evidence that Christians, given their close relationship to Judean religion, were also accused of donkey worship. Alexamenos' identity is a mystery, but it's probably Jesus on the cross in this piece of ancient graffiti. The longest ending of Mark. We discussed earlier the abrupt original ending to Mark and the 2 most common endings that appear in the manuscript tradition, but there is an even longer, stranger, and more rare ending. Codex Washingtonianus, a 4th or 5th century Greek Bible, contains the so-called longest ending of Mark, also named the Freer Logion, after C.L. Freer, the American art collector who purchased the manuscript and brought it to the Smithsonian. This manuscript contains the longer ending of Mark, like the majority of manuscripts. But after verse 14, when Jesus reappears to the 11 disciples for the first time, the disciples give an explanation for why they doubted the women's testimony. The present age, the disciples explained, was under the power of Satan, who prevented people from knowing the truth. Jesus rebukes them, saying he overcame the power of Satan so that his followers could believe. After this paragraph-length exchange, the longer ending of Mark resumes as found in other manuscripts. This is, unfortunately, the only manuscript that preserves this longest ending of Mark, but we know this story wasn't unique to Codex Washingtonianus. Jerome, a 4th century Christian scholar, partially quotes the story and says it appeared in many Greek manuscripts. Calling out to Helios. Mark reports Jesus' cry of dereliction in Aramaic before giving it in Greek. The Aramaic is transposed Eloi, Eloi, meaning my God, my God. The bystanders, Mark tells us, assume Jesus is calling out to Elijah and wait to see if anything will happen. In one Old Latin manuscript, Codex Bobiensis, the transcribed Aramaic is rendered Heli, Heli. Amazingly, the bystanders in this text do not assume Jesus is calling out to Elijah, but to Helios, the Greek god of the sun. In this 4th century copy of Mark, then, the witnesses of the crucifixion suspect that Jesus called upon a pagan deity. Did someone steal the body? The charge that someone stole Jesus' body goes all the way back to the New Testament. The Jewish elders and priests, according to the Gospel of Matthew, bribed the Roman soldiers to tell the people that Jesus' disciples stole the body. And this story is still told, Matthew says, among the Jewish people until this day. Justin's dialogue with Trypho, a 2nd century dialogue between a Christian and a Jew, attributes this argument to its Jewish speaker. This might reflect the line of argument used by 2nd century Jewish thinkers, but it's difficult to say since the author might have just based it on the Gospel of Matthew. There is another hint of such a charge in the New Testament. When Mary sees the risen Jesus in the Gospel of John, she mistakes him for a gardener and says, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." The 4th Gospel thus points to the possibility that a third party might have taken Jesus' body away. Such an accusation, in fact, appears in an authentically Jewish anti-Christian text. The Toldet Yeshu is a late antique anti-gospel, satirizing the canonical gospels and expanding on anti-Christian polemics in the Talmud. According to this text, Jesus' body was moved by a gardener in order to prevent his disciples from stealing it. It is possible that the Toldet Yeshu is preserving a 1st or 2nd century Jewish critique of Christianity known to the author of John. But at the same time, it is plausible that this anti-gospel is drawing on the idea of the disciples or someone stealing the body from the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Matthew. In the end, the only good evidence that anyone at the time suggested Jesus' body was stolen comes from Christian sources, though that is hardly surprising given how few non-Christian sources we have for anything about the life of Jesus. Layer 5, Apocryphal Narratives. Jesus, the Shapeshifter. It's well known that the Quran denies that Jesus was crucified, but did you know that this idea was anticipated in several early Christian sources? The Quranic tradition appears in Surah 4, where the Jewish people are depicted as boasting that they had killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary. But they neither killed nor crucified him, the Quran retorts. It was only made to appear so. This is variously interpreted across Islamic traditions, but the mainstream view is that the Romans were fooled into crucifying someone other than Jesus. The idea of a substitute on the cross first appears in a Gnostic text discovered at Nag Hammadi. The 2nd tractate of the great Seth reads, "Yes, they saw me, they punished me. It was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not me. They struck me with the reed. It was another, Simon, who bore the cross on his shoulder. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns. But I was rejoicing in the height over all the wealth of the archons and the offspring of their error, of their empty glory. And I was laughing at their ignorance, and I subjected all their powers. For as I came downward, no one saw me, for I was altering my shapes, changing from form to form." This text is characteristically difficult to interpret. Jesus claims that someone other than himself experienced each event of his passion, including the gall he drank on the cross. Irenaeus of Lyon, who appears to have misattributed this text to a heretic named Basilides, interpreted it to mean that Simon was crucified instead of Jesus. Another parallel in the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter describes the separation of the divine Christ from the earthly Jesus before the latter could be crucified. It's plausible that the author of Surah 4 in the Quran was influenced by these deviant early Christian traditions about the death of Jesus. Numerological significance of the cross. Ancient Greek, the language in which the Gospels were written, uses the same symbols for letters and numbers. Alpha is 1, beta is 2, etc. This allowed ancient readers to find numerological significance in names or hidden meanings in numbers. A good example of this is how Nero Caesar equals 666 in the book of Revelation. It occurred to some early Christian leaders that the shape of the tau resembled a cross. The letter tau, moreover, is the symbol for 300. The cross, thereby, could be associated with the number 300. When early Christians found occurrences of the number 300 in the Jewish scriptures, they understood these as prefigurements of Jesus' death. This particular numerological argument appears in one of the earliest non-canonical Christian writings, the pseudonymous Epistle of Barnabas. Writing near the turn of the 2nd century, this author saw in the 300 men circumcised by the Jewish patriarch Abraham a symbol of the cross. My power, my power. We already discussed the various words attributed to Jesus in the canonical Gospels, but There were more than 4 stories about Jesus circulating in the early centuries. The Gospel of Peter, an extra-canonical gospel that achieved some popularity in the 2nd century, portrays Jesus using his last breath to express a different sentiment. My power, says Jesus, you have forsaken me. The statement is obviously similar to the cry of dereliction used in Matthew and Mark, but instead of addressing God, Jesus speaks about his power. Early church historian Eusebius reports that some early Christians cited this gospel to justify their belief that the divine part of Jesus separated from the human part as he was dying. Probably these Christians, called Docetus by their opponents, interpreted this statement as the human Jesus' cry of despair being abandoned by the divine Christ. It is possible, however, that this was an ancient misunderstanding of the gospel itself. A popular translation of the Jewish scriptures produced by Aquila rendered Psalm 22:1, my strength, my strength. The language of power or strength was an established circumlocution for God. Possibly, the Gospel of Peter is just a more pious rendering of Psalm 22, using power as a euphemism for God. Upside-down crucifixion. Alright, this one isn't about Jesus, but rather about the crucifixion of one of his closest disciples. The apocryphal Acts of Peter reports that Peter was condemned to crucifixion on the charge of godlessness. When the soldiers begin to crucify him, Peter requests that he be crucified upside down. He then delivers a speech, apparently mid-crucifixion, about the symbolic significance of his inverted crucifixion. The position of his body, for instance, represents the natural birth of human beings, head first down toward the earth. No doubt, most of this apocryphal Acts is legend, but it may contain a nugget of truth. The 3rd century Latin apologist Tertullian was no fan of apocryphal Acts, and he believed that Peter was crucified. Origen, a half-century later, knows the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down. And we do, in fact, have reports of Roman soldiers crucifying their victims in all kinds of strange positions, including upside down. Josephus describes Roman soldiers under Titus crucifying Jews outside of Jerusalem in different positions for their own amusement. Additionally, Seneca specifically describes upside-down crucifixions. It is therefore possible that the apocryphal Acts of Peter preserves a memory of Peter's torture at the hands of callous Roman soldiers. The robbers' names. The robbers crucified with Jesus, we've already discussed, probably weren't thieves, and from a historical perspective, there's nothing more we can really say about them. Religious traditions, on the other hand, just abhor vacuums. As with so many other nameless figures in Jewish and Christian Bibles, these robbers eventually acquired names. An old Latin manuscript, Codex Colbertinus, names these robbers Zoetham on the right and Comma on the left, in the text of both Matthew and Mark. The Gospel of Nicodemus provides 2 alternative names, Demas for the penitent thief and Gestas for the impenitent. This pair of names is also found throughout the Coptic Orthodox tradition as early as the 4th century. Finally, the Syriac Infancy Gospel furnishes a fuller narrative. In this book, Mary, Joseph, and the infant Jesus are waylaid by robbers on their flight to Egypt. One robber named Titus persuades another named Dumachus to release the Holy Family. The former becomes the penitent thief, and the latter the impenitent. The walking, talking cross. The canonical Gospels describe the aftermath of Jesus' resurrection and some supernatural events surrounding the appearances of the risen Jesus, but none describe the actual resurrection itself. Such a description can, however, be found in the aforementioned Gospel of Peter. Jewish leaders and Roman soldiers alike in this account stand guard at Jesus' tomb to prevent the disciples from stealing the body. Additionally, an entire crowd came from Jerusalem to see the sealed tomb. Then, on Saturday night, at the beginning of the day after the Sabbath on the Jewish calendar, a voice sounded from heaven, the sky split open, and 2 radiant angels descended before the tomb. The stone rolled away of its own volition, and then the 2 angels went in. When they were inside the tomb, those on guard woke up everyone who was present. 3 figures then come out, angels supporting Jesus in between them. The Gospel says that the heads of the angels reached the heavens, and the head of Jesus went beyond the heavens. Everyone's favorite detail comes next. Behind the 3 figures, the Gospel seems to say, came the cross itself. A voice from heaven asks the cross if it had preached to the dead, And the cross says yes. Everyone present, the author assures us, saw the same thing, but Pilate, at the request of the people, ordered that no one ever admit it. And there it is, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, Iceberg. For most of their history, the story of Jesus' life and death, as well as other Christian narratives, were only investigated theologically. Certain things are just not to be questioned, people used to think. Lucky for those of us who are open to following the evidence wherever it leads, this is not the case in reputable academic institutions today. This means that information and ideas like those presented here are just a class, page turn, or click away for most of us. I, for one, am incredibly grateful to the critical scholars who have made that possible. Now, remember that if you'd like to go even deeper into the resurrection story, hearing two scholars debate its historicity in probably the most thorough exchange on the topic available anywhere, click the link in the description and pinned comment to register for the event, Did the Resurrection of Jesus Really Happen? No matter when you sign up, you'll have permanent access to the all-day debate, and you'll be supporting my channel in the process, so thank you. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thank you to Dr. Ian Mills and Dr. Bart Ehrman for making this video possible. Another thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.